It was the early 1910s, a time when wealth met wellness in strange ways. Tired of pills and empty promises, upper-class men and women began whispering about a mysterious place hidden deep within the evergreens of Washington state. They weren't chasing fame or even traditional medicine. They were chasing a cure wrapped in silence, starvation, and surrender. They called it fasting therapy, a radical method that promised to cleanse the body and soul. At the heart of this movement was a woman named Linda Burfield Hazard, a figure who blurred the line between healer and harbinger. She wasn't a licensed physician, not in the real sense. But through a loophole carved out for so-called natural healers, she was able to hang a certificate on her wall and call herself a doctor. And to the people who entered her domain, that title was enough. She built a secluded compound in the hills of Olalla, Washington, a place so remote it might as well have existed off the map. Linda named it Wilderness Heights. It sounded peaceful, soothing, healing. But the locals had a darker name for it, Starvation Heights. Her reputation grew fast. She wrote books, toured as a speaker, and presented her theories with the kind of certainty that silenced questions. According to Linda, the body was burdened by toxins, and the only way to purge them was to stop eating. Not for a day, not for a week, but for as long as it took, until the body healed. I first stumbled upon this story while reading about Claire Williamson, a 34-year-old woman from Britain who had placed her faith and her life in Linda's hands. Claire, like many others, had arrived hoping to restore her health. Instead, she withered away under a starvation plan that lasted more than 40 days. By the time her body gave out, she was unrecognizable, her muscles wasted, her spirit broken. But perhaps the most chilling part was her final note to her sister. "I think I'm getting better, just a few more days." That sentence haunts you. It doesn't just speak to the power of belief. It screams of how blind faith, when manipulated, becomes a weapon. Claire wasn't the only one. Dozens passed through the doors of Wilderness Heights, believing they were being healed while their bodies collapsed from within. And behind the curtain of wellness, something more sinister was at play. Bank accounts were drained, wills rewritten, possessions transferred into Linda's name, and no one could stop it. You see, Linda had created the perfect storm, an environment where death didn't look like murder. Patients signed everything voluntarily. They fasted willingly. They believed they were on the edge of salvation. And when they died, it was written off as personal choice, not crime. The house had no electricity, no clean running water. Meals consisted of strained vegetable broth. Enemas were performed daily. Massages were routine. All of it meticulously logged in Linda's journals, not as care, but as doctrine, ritual, proof of her method. The authorities were helpless. The law had no teeth. Consent papers protected her, and her voice, always sharp, always certain, kept the skeptics at bay. Linda stood at the center of her empire like a high priestess of pain, cloaked not in compassion, but in calculated cruelty. And that is only the beginning. The newspapers didn't know what to make of her. When articles about Linda Hazard's controversial clinic began to surface, they read like a tug-of-war between horror and hope. Critics called her methods dangerous. But nestled between those accusations were glowing testimonials from survivors, patients who claimed her treatment had changed their lives. The truth was elusive. Those who lived through it rarely gave the full story. When they did speak, it was in vague praises, as if even they weren't sure whether they had been saved or simply spared. And that's where Linda's power lived, in the grey zone. She wasn't painted as a villain outright. She wasn't hailed as a hero either. She existed in the space between, a riddle with a heartbeat. Her name still lingers in the annals of true crime, not because she chased notoriety, but because so many walked into her clinic willingly and never walked out. They didn't arrive in handcuffs or stretchers. They came with hope. They came in search of healing, and somehow they left believing the suffering was part of the cure. Fasting wasn't a novel concept, and Linda wasn't the first to push it as medicine. Her ideas were heavily inspired by Dr. Edward Hooker Dewey, a 19th century American physician who wrote the No Breakfast Plan and the Fasting Cure. Dewey had argued that food, particularly morning meals, was the root of chronic illness. Linda simply took that idea and dialed it to a punishing extreme. In her 1908 self-published book, Fasting for the Cure of Disease, she laid out her theory with near religious conviction. According to her, eating was indulgence. True hunger was rare, and most people simply gave in to desire. She wrote, "Appetite is desire. Hunger is want. Desire is never satisfied, but want is soothed when need is met." To Hazard, food wasn't nourishment, it was the enemy. And her cure? A slow, calculated starvation process that would supposedly cleanse the body and reveal its true strength. Patients were restricted to sips of thin vegetable broth. They received daily enemas and deep tissue massages so violent, nurses quietly questioned their purpose. Even when bodies began to fail, when patients became frail, dizzy, or incoherent, Linda stood firm. According to her, the symptoms were not signs of danger. They were proof that the toxins were leaving. One of her earliest documented patients was Daisy Maud Hagland, a Norwegian immigrant and young mother. After weeks of fasting under Linda's care, Daisy died in 1908. She left behind a toddler named Ivar Hagland. The same Ivar who would later grow up to launch Seattle's famous Ivar's seafood restaurants. He was just 3 years old when his mother starved to death, believing she was being healed. But Linda's most infamous case would come later, with two sisters who had no reason to suspect danger. Claire and Dorothea Williamson, known as Claire and Dora, were everything society admired at the time. Poised, educated, well-travelled and wealthy. They were daughters of a respected British military officer. And like many others in their social class, they were growing sceptical of conventional medicine. This was a new era, a time when people sought healing through spirituality, diet and nature. The Williamson sisters were ahead of that curve. They had already turned away from meat, discarded corsets and read widely about natural remedies. It wasn't illness that drove them to Linda. It was ideology. A belief that the body could heal itself if only it were given the chance to do so, without interference. While staying at the Grand Empress Hotel in Victoria, British Columbia, they came across a curious book in a newspaper ad. It was Hazard's Fasting for the Cure of Disease. The title alone intrigued them, but it was the tone that pulled them in. It didn't read like medical advice. It felt like scripture, a sacred ritual dressed in clinical language. Claire believed she had a mild uterine condition. Dora complained of fatigue and vague aches. There was no emergency, no urgent need for intervention. But both sisters were drawn in by Hazard's promise of renewal. Claire wrote that she had finally found the most beautiful treatment she had ever encountered. And so they packed their trunks, left behind the comfort of luxury, and boarded a ferry to a small town no one in their circle had ever heard of. Olalla, Washington. The destination? A quiet wooden house in the forest, hidden from view. A place that looked nothing like a hospital, a place that would soon become infamous, a place they wouldn't leave unchanged if they left at all. When Claire and Dora Williamson stepped off the train in Seattle in February of 1911, they didn't go straight to the infamous institute they had read so much about. Instead, their introduction to Linda Hazard's regimen began quietly, inside a modest apartment in the Capitol Hill district. It wasn't a hospital, it didn't look like a clinic, but the treatment had already begun. Their days were stripped bare. No solid food, just thin tomato broth, barely enough to sustain a child, enemas that lasted for hours, massages so forceful they left bruises instead of relief. Claire kept a journal in those early days. One entry read, "Each enema is a cleansing, painful but necessary." She wasn't documenting torture. She believed she was chronicling a transformation. Hunger wasn't seen as a warning sign, it was a milestone, an expected symptom of renewal. Their commitment ran deeper than reason. Neither sister informed their relatives back home. It wasn't secrecy born from guilt, it was exhaustion. They were tired of being questioned for the choices they made in pursuit of better health. This wasn't rebellion, it was faith, and it would cost them everything. By the time they were finally transferred to Olalla, they were already shadows of themselves, weak, gaunt and glassy-eyed. But still, they stayed, they trusted. That's what makes the story so devastating. Claire and Dora weren't tricked by a scam or forced into submission. They walked into it with belief, not because someone waved a miracle cure in their face, but because a philosophy had promised something more powerful than medicine: purity, rebirth, control over the self. And Linda Hazard? She knew exactly how to package that promise. But the cracks in her operation began to show, because even the most calculated deception can't stay hidden forever. The unravelling began not with sirens or lawsuits, but with a single strange message. A short telegram sent across oceans to a woman named Margaret Conway, a former governess of the Williamson sisters then vacationing in Australia. The message was vague, unsettling and incomplete, but it was enough. Margaret booked a ship to the Pacific Northwest. What she found on arrival was nothing short of a nightmare. Dora lay on a bed, barely more than a frame draped in skin. The confident, worldly woman who once toured Europe and debated philosophy now couldn't sit up without trembling. Her body had collapsed in on itself. Each breath looked like work. But even worse than the physical decline was the paperwork. Legal documents, all altered. Linda Hazard, still referring to herself as a doctor, had named herself the executor of Claire's will, and now she had taken it a step further. She was Dora's legal guardian. Not only that, but her husband, Samuel Hazard, a man with a criminal record and a history of forgery, had been granted full authority over Dora's affairs. Claire's belongings, her jewellery, her clothes, even her personal letters, had vanished. Margaret was stunned to find Linda wearing Claire's dressing gown, casually offering her a signed psychiatric statement claiming Dora was mentally unfit to leave. There was no law protecting Margaret from what she knew to be wrong. As a former servant, she was hesitant to confront people with wealth and authority. Linda knew that. She used it. Her voice had weight. Her presence chilled the room. Locals whispered that her eyes were unnerving, that her calm, sharp tone could silence a room without raising a finger. Some even believed Linda had dabbled in more than just medicine. Whispers of spiritualism, theosophy, and occult practices circled around her. She wasn't just a doctor to her patients. To some, she was a prophet, to others, something far darker. There were those who truly believed she had the power to hypnotize, to convince a person that starvation wasn't just healing, and that belief, it turned out to be the most lethal ingredient of all. Eventually, Margaret Conway did what the sisters themselves could not. She broke the silence. Desperate and out of options, she penned a heartfelt letter to John Herbert, the Williamsons' uncle. When he received it in Portland, the urgency was clear. Within days, he was on his way to Olalla. What he walked into wasn't just a medical centre. It was a house cloaked in death and secrecy. And to get Dora out alive, John had to do something unthinkable. Pay nearly $1,000 to Linda Hazard. Not for care, not for damages, simply to release her from treatment. But rescuing Dora was only the beginning. The real fight started when the British Vice-Consul in Tacoma, Lucien Agassiz, got involved. Together, he and John Herbert pushed for a full criminal investigation. And for the first time, Linda Burfield Hazard wasn't just a controversial figure, she was a murder suspect. The story didn't quietly fade into closure. It erupted. The public, the press, and the authorities all descended on Olalla. And as they peeled back the layers of Linda's operation, it became clear this wasn't one tragic misjudgment. It was an entire system built on deception and death. This wasn't just about Claire Williamson. As the investigation widened, more names emerged, more bodies, more wealth that had mysteriously changed hands. Lewis E. Rader, once a state legislator and the original owner of the very land that housed Wilderness Heights, died under Linda's care, before he could testify. John Ivan Flux, a British traveller who came to Washington looking to buy farmland, ended up dead. When investigators reviewed his belongings, all he had left was $70. Eugene Wakelin, a New Zealander, died during one of Hazard's infamous fasting treatments, and just before his death, his assets had already been transferred straight to Linda. In total, at least 12 documented deaths were linked to her clinic, but residents in Olalla suspected far more. They spoke of quiet burials, nighttime wagons, empty beds that were never filled again, whispers of how quickly people disappeared. On August 15th, 1911, authorities had enough. Linda Hazard was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The trial began in early 1912 at the Kitsap County Courthouse. And for the first time, the inner workings of Wilderness Heights were forced into daylight. Former staff took the stand. They described agonizing screams that echoed through the hallways during treatments. Nurses recalled enemas that stretched into hours, massages that left patients bruised, and scalding baths that were anything but therapeutic. What was described in court was not healing. It was horror dressed as health. One court official would later call it torture masquerading as therapy. But there was another layer, a quieter kind of abuse that cut just as deep: financial starvation. Prosecutors laid out a trail of forged documents, suspicious banking transactions, and drained accounts. The Williamson sisters' wealth had been siphoned off long before Claire ever died. The paper trail told a story of manipulation far more sinister than anything visible to the eye. Then came a twist that stunned even seasoned reporters. There were rumours of a body switch, that Linda Hazard had allegedly worked with Butterworth Mortuary to exchange Claire's corpse with another, all in an effort to hide the true condition of her remains. Though never confirmed, the mere possibility sent shockwaves through the courtroom and the public. Because, if true, it meant Linda hadn't just stolen lives and fortunes, she had tried to erase the evidence of her crimes. And for the first time, the world could no longer look away. Linda Hazard stood in court with the same composure she used to wield over her patients. Unshaken, unapologetic. She didn't flinch as the charges were read. In her eyes, she wasn't a criminal on trial. She was a visionary being crucified. She didn't deny what had happened, but she denied the blame. Her defense? The body fails because it is weak, flawed from within, not because of her methods, not because of the fasting. Death during fasting, she argued, is never caused by lack of food. It is the inevitable result of a body already broken. To Linda, this wasn't about justice. It was war. A war between her version of truth and the establishment that never accepted her. In her mind, this was medicine clinging to power, men clinging to control, and she, a woman leading a radical health movement, was their scapegoat. And strangely, not everyone saw her as the villain. Voices from the alternative health world rose in her defense. Supporters called her a misunderstood pioneer. Even Henry S. Tanner, the man who once famously fasted for 40 days in New York, offered to speak on her behalf. Linda had created a following, and that following didn't crumble easily. She spoke in metaphors, in scripture, in philosophies that reached across centuries. From the fasts of yogis to the purification rituals of the Bible, she framed starvation as sacred. Death, she claimed, was not failure, it was ascension. And that's what makes this case so chilling. Linda Hazard didn't just kill with conviction. She created a belief system where death was a step toward light, a healer in form, a predator in practice. For me, this was the first time I encountered a case where a female serial killer hid behind science. Not knives, not poison, but behind wellness, behind handwritten prescriptions for a better life. And the people who died, they didn't resist. They followed her, one step at a time, straight to the edge. She wasn't sentenced to life. Not even close. Linda Hazard was convicted of manslaughter, not murder, and served just 2 years at Walla Walla Prison. 2 years for the death of Claire Williamson and the trail of corpses behind her. After prison, she vanished from the public eye for a while, but she didn't vanish for good. She returned to Olalla, reopened her clinic, and continued practicing the same therapy under the same name, Wilderness Heights. Only this time, the world was watching. Doctors began to speak louder. Newspapers were less forgiving. The spell had weakened, but it wasn't gone. Years later, the woman who told others to fast to their deaths would die by her own doctrine, starving herself in the name of healing. Her supporters called it poetic, others called it justice. But for the families of her victims, it was far too late for either. And yet, Linda Hazard's legacy didn't disappear. Her name lives on, not just in court records or yellowed newspapers, but in textbooks on criminal psychology, in college lectures about consent and coercion, in podcasts and documentaries trying to answer the same lingering question: how did she get away with it for so long? Because nothing about this was hidden. Nothing was forced. People walked in willingly, signed their names, surrendered their rights, and handed over their futures, all under the illusion that pain would lead to purification. Everything about Linda's process was clean, legal, and silent. Every paper signed, every bank account emptied without resistance. Every scream explained away. She didn't need to run, she didn't need to hide, she just needed belief. And that's what lingers long after the case is closed. There was no blood-soaked crime scene, no rampage, just a woman in a black dress offering salvation by subtraction, a process that turned death into a destination. And in the end, it wasn't just Linda Hazard who made that possible. It was the world around her, a world that tolerated it, that stayed silent. That blurred the lines between healing and control, between science and mysticism, between desperation and danger. And that's what keeps me awake after reading cases like this, because when the right words meet the right moment in someone's life, how many of us would sign the dotted line? The real horror isn't Linda. It's that we might not recognize her until it's too late.